Oh, thanks for being here, you guys. Hopefully, if you're getting the late afternoon food coma thing from lunch, hopefully this will wake you up a little bit, like talking about Windows for 45 minutes. Just a little bit about me. My name's Matt Davis. I'm a senior principal software engineer on Ansible Core, and I spend a fair amount of my time dealing with Windows. Windows has been putting food on my table for a really long time. I've spent some time in the Linux world. I've spent some time as a Mac user. I've spent a lot of time in the Windows world, and you know, it's a really great thing. It's something that I like a lot. I came to Ansible through a startup that we got a mandate from our CTO to automate a bunch of AWS stuff that was really expensive. We had running a dev stack in our on our AWS stuff we used at the time. They were a C2 8XL, so if you know how big that is, that's a really expensive AWS machine. And we would run a whole bunch of them. And so people would just spin up a dev stack, and it'd take you like a day to do it manually, and then nobody wanted to tear it down, so they just sit out there. So this little startup of, you know, like 10 people or so, we got our first AWS bill for 20 grand, and there was a little bit of angst about that. So the CTO said, you know what, I'm going to write a thing that's going to go out every night and nuke everything that's not marked production. So you guys probably better start working on some automation. So nothing like baptism by fire, right? So you know, I went out and took a look, and this task for whatever reason ended up falling to me. So I went out and looked at, I'd looked at Puppet, I looked at Chef, I looked at a few other things, and just kind of like, you know, this is too hard. There's a lot of stuff. I don't want to own this forever. I want to like kind of build this thing, and I want to move on, get back to doing the stuff that I normally do as a developer. I don't want to like have to own and babysit this automation stuff all the time. So. Somebody pointed me at Ansible. I got a hold of it, and you know, within about 15 minutes, I was doing real stuff, and I was converted. I was singing the praises of Ansible going forward, and you know, long story short, like that startup didn't do really well for reasons that had nothing to do with Ansible. And after it folded, I had a friend that said, you know, I got a friend that works at Ansible. Like, you guys should talk, because by that point, I had actually started like making some contributions to the open source side of Ansible, and I really enjoyed it. So that was actually where I ended up going from that startup. I came over to Ansible, spent about a year out in the field doing services work with Ansible. So like you know, helping customers kind of apply DevOps things, figure out how Ansible should fit into their workflow and into the things that they do every day. And you know, you get to see the whole gamut there, from people that really get it and are like extending Ansible and doing all these things to like, what's DevOps? I don't understand. So it's been a fun ride, but I got to the point where on the days off where I was not doing consulting gigs, I would start working on the fairly rudimentary Windows support that Ansible had at the time. And it got to a point where I missed kind of doing product engineering stuff every day, so I came back, and right around the time of the Red Hat acquisition, there were resources available to like allow me to start working on this full time. The core team was all like, "We don't have to touch the Windows stuff anymore. Great, please take it." So it was not a hard sell to move on to the core team, and that's where I've been ever since, and I love it. So. As you may have gathered, I kind of love Windows. Like, I don't maybe love it quite as much as these guys, but I really do like Windows. So before we get going here too fast, can I just a couple of quick poll questions for the room? How many people in here hate Windows? Really? Are you being honest? That's actually a really small number. I'm amazed, because usually when I do this talk other places, about 2/3 or more of the room raises their hand. Okay, how many of you are using Ansible today? All right, sweet. How many of you are using Ansible to manage Windows today? Okay, good. A room full of people to convert. There's a, you know, it's looking like maybe about a quarter to a third of you are doing that, for the people in the front that couldn't see back there. One more poll question then, real quick. How many of you know this movie? Okay, well, for those of you that don't, let me give you a quick summary, because it'll be relevant later. So this is a 90s teeny bopper flick. It's a remake of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. It stars our Cat and Patrick, and Cat's kind of a man-hating, you know, just she doesn't like guys, and her little sister isn't allowed to date until she is. So it's kind of a ploy by her father to try and preserve her little sister's innocence. And so somebody ends up paying Patrick to take her out, and she initially hates him and all of his bad habits. But eventually she kind of falls for him, and at the end of the movie, she reads him a poem describing a whole bunch of things that she hates about him, but then kind of how she's changed her tune about him. So I'll have my own version of that poem for you guys at the end of today's presentation. So with that, let's get into this. The first thing that people usually hate about Windows is it's not SSH. So if you're coming at this from a Linux management thing, especially if you've been using Ansible, Ansible speaks SSH by default, right? If you need to go in and manage something, SSH is a really great protocol. It's got lots of really nice flexible things around authentication. It's pretty resilient to crummy connections. It's a pretty great thing. Windows, on the other hand, uses WinRM, which is this HTTP SOAP-based XML remote shell protocol that's obviously a product of the early 2000s, and it's pretty fugly if you ever actually have to look at it down at that layer where I do sometimes. But it gets the job done. You don't have to care about that as a user because WinRM gets the job done, okay? It's a remote shell protocol. You can do all the same kinds of things you can do through SSH. It's a non-interactive logon, which causes some problems sometimes because you don't have all the things like credential caches, and the data protection API doesn't work. There's a few things that don't work for you in a non-interactive login. In Ansible, we have ways of taking care of some of those things. It uses a different connection plugin. So, again, Ansible by default speaks SSH, but if you weren't aware of this, there's a pluggable connection transport layer that we can switch out the protocol that Ansible uses so that you can use SSH. You can talk over Docker. You can talk over AWS Run. You can talk over Shroot. You can talk over, there's a whole bunch of different things that where you can kind of switch that out. So one of the other ones that we ship in the box is WinRM. Another thing that we get asked about a lot around SSH on the Windows side is, hey, Microsoft's been working on this OpenSSH port. Like, when are you guys going to work with that? Microsoft's actually finally, I think they've shipped a 1.0 of that thing finally. And while they aren't shipping it in the box with Windows yet, they sort of are. It's an installable feature on, I think, the Server 1709 and a couple of the latest Win 10 builds. But the rumor is that Server 2019 will actually ship this thing in the box. So that's around the time where we're going to start, we actually do have a proof of concept of this working already to do Ansible management of Windows over that OpenSSH, using Microsoft's OpenSSH server. So it's a thing we're paying attention to, and the proof of concept kind of brought out a couple of things that we knew were going to be issues, and there are things that we need to change, some little architectural rough edges on Ansible, that there's some kind of SSH-isms and POSIX-isms that are a little too tightly ingrained in there, some things we need to move around to make that really work as something that's very seamless to just be like, sure, use WinRM, use SSH, whatever. But so today, if you want to do this, it's going to be WinRM. So let me show you how quick and easy it is to get connected up to a Windows machine. We're going to just do it from scratch right here. I have a brand new Windows Vagrant VM here. This machine has never been set up for WinRM. So pretty much all modern versions of Windows ship with WinRM in the box, but it is not turned on except on the very latest ones. So we have to do something to turn it on. Now, WinRM supports a couple of different models. It's HTTP, so the default stuff, if you just use, there's a tool called WinRM Quick Config that you can run that will go and just kind of light up WinRM on an HTTP listener, and it expects to use message encryption. So it's still a pretty secure way to do things because the actual payloads and everything are encrypted. But we also ship a script that will turn it on and set up some user, set up the user stuff and make sure everything's working right. And it'll set it up with HTTPS and a self-signed certificate. So I'll demo that for you today, but just know that message encryption is also an option. It's a fairly recent option because it's much more complex to deal with on the PyWinRM library that actually is doing all of the WinRM communication. So I'm just going to run this. I have a local copy of it here because we don't trust conference Wi-Fi. So it's just called Configure Remoting for Ansible. And if you look in the Ansible Windows docs on how to get started, like, we point you to this script. But again, if you're doing message encryption, WinRM Quick Config works just as well. So this is going to go out. It's going to create a self-signed cert, set up an HTTP listener, make sure everything's turned on and configured. It'll run for a couple seconds, chug out some stuff. Now, this Windows machine is ready to be managed by WinRM. So from the Ansible side, the very first thing we need to do, so I told you that Ansible ships with the WinRM connection plugin. That's true. It does not, however, ship with the PyWinRM dependency that is used by the WinRM connection plugin. So that's something you need to install. It is available in Apple, I believe. If you're doing it that way, I'm going to just do pip. So we'll just do pip install PyWinRM. OK, poof, we have PyWinRM. Now we're going to create an inventory from scratch to talk to this Windows machine. So we'll just create a host file, and we'll say, give me that. And we'll go ahead and put it in a group called Win. We'll just make a group called Win, and then we'll set some vars for everything that's going to be in the Win group. So the very first thing, we need to give it a username and password. Oops. And I just happen to know since this is a Vagrant box. Now, if this were a Linux machine and you had password authentication turned on, you'd be done, right? Like Ansible speaks SSH, everything's cool. If you try to speak SSH to a Windows machine that doesn't have SSH installed, you're going to be talking to dead air. So the first thing we need to do is tell Ansible, hey, this thing's speaking WinRM. So we'll say Ansible connection equals WinRM. And remember I said there's a couple ways we can talk to this thing. If you're doing the HTTP message encryption stuff, again, because the message encryption stuff didn't exist back when we first did all of this, Ansible defaults to expecting to talk over HTTPS. So we either need to tell it, hey, we're using a self-site insert, don't try to validate it because you're not going to get there. Or we need to tell it, use HTTP on port 5985. So we're going to go with the SSH route, or the SSL route today. So we'll say Ansible WinRM server cert validation equals ignore. So the default on that is, again, we default to secure, so we assume that you've actually distributed properly validatable certs. This is just a switch that lets you turn that off. So if I've done everything right here, that's a big if, live demos and all, right? So if I've done everything right here, I should be able to ping this machine now. Now you'll notice when I do this, I'm going to say Ansible. We want to target the Win group that we just created. It just has that one host in it. But as with SSH or anything else, you can talk to Windows hosts in parallel the exact same way. You can talk to 5 hosts, 100 hosts, as long as you've got a beefy enough control machine. We want to tell it we're going to use the host file that we just created. And we're going to tell it we want to run the Win ping module. Now, a common mistake that people make here is assuming that the modules are the same between the Linux and the Windows side. Now, we try to keep the UIs as similar as possible on modules that do the same thing. So on the POSIX side, you have a ping module. On the Windows side, we preface almost all of the modules with win underscore to differentiate, because the implementations are very different, as we'll talk about here in just a minute. So if I've done everything right, OK. Now, this doesn't look too Windowsy, does it? This looks pretty much the same as if you were talking to a Linux machine, I think. There's nothing too scary about that. So that's all it takes to get that going. It's pretty easy to talk to a Windows machine. And now this thing is manageable. We can run all the Windows modules we want. Everything's going to work just pretty much exactly as we expect. OK. So the next thing people hate about Windows, PowerShell. If you, my personal first experience with PowerShell, I hated it. It's so verbose. It's just kind of clunky. There was something I just didn't like about it. I couldn't explain it, but after spending many years in a POSIX-y command line environment, I just didn't like PowerShell. Once I started actually coding, doing real work in PowerShell and stringing things together, I kind of fell in love with it. I guess if you're not familiar with the object pipeline in PowerShell, it's magic. I mean, compared to when you get structured output from all of the commands and you can just dot into things and you have full object graphs coming out of something instead of a big stream of text that you're cutting and setting and awking and doing all sorts of nasty things to pluck little bits out of it, and then good luck if somebody revs the output of the tool and it changes a little bit and all your seds and awks and cuts need to be hacked up. PowerShell doesn't have that problem because you have structured output coming in. You're just dotting into it, give me the interface ID of that NIC or whatever from it doesn't matter. It's very stable. And the other big reason that PowerShell was chosen as the implementation language for Ansible modules, so all of the modules that we ship inside Ansible for Windows are written in PowerShell. And the reason that that was done is because we wanted to choose the thing that's just there, right? WinRM ships in the box, PowerShell ships in the box. It would be really easy, and actually in the very early days of Ansible, there were people that were actually doing Windows management using Python modules, either hacked up versions of the Linux Python modules that existed, or people were making like Windows-specific Python modules. But now you have to go install Python on all those machines before you can manage them. It's really nice to just deal with the stuff that's in the box. So that's the reason that PowerShell was chosen there. The other great thing about using PowerShell for this is that we can use .NET. .NET has a huge amount of stuff available to us for machine management and very complex data handling, and just .NET is very, very powerful, and it's great to have access to that when we're building modules to do things. So Ansible's requirements for PowerShell: we need PowerShell 3 and higher on Windows 7 or Server 2008 and higher. So Vista, if you have a Vista machine, please don't tell me you're trying to manage Vista machines, but if you have Vista, or if you have, I get occasionally people ask us about XP or Server 2003, sorry, like you can't manage that this way. There are some kind of limited ways that you can use Ansible to manage those things. You can use things like the WinPS exec module. You can do multi-hop stuff through PowerShell remoting, and there are some options there, but they're not great. Like, hopefully you're managing more modern stuff. The other really cool thing that's happening with PowerShell is that by having PowerShell available, and we have access to the entire universe of DSC resources that are being built. So there's a very active community on the Microsoft side that builds these DSC management resources. And Ansible has a module called WinDSC that ships in the box that allows you to call any of those DSC resources as if they were an Ansible module. So you can use them from a playbook, and it just works. So that's if there's something that you can't do in Ansible, but there's a DSC resource for it. As long as you've got PowerShell 5.1 or better on those target machines, you can use the DSC resource. So do be aware of what's going on out there in the DSC world as well, because those things play nicely with Ansible too. Next thing everybody hates dealing with Windows: app installation and maintenance. So, on a Linux system, on pretty much anything modern these days, there's a package manager of some kind. I don't have to care where the thing lives. It has version metadata. I can tell if I've got the latest without just going and like reading a website. I can do things like, app update, yum update, like just get me up to date on whatever's here. So Windows has historically been kind of missing that. You have the Windows Store, but it's not really all that automatable, and most things still aren't available in the Windows Store. So the best thing that we've got there, and it's a great thing, there's a community project that started a few years ago called Chocolatey. And Chocolatey actually gives you a package manager for Windows and a community resource that hosts them, and then people can go and manage and create packages that wrap exes and MSIs and things like that. And they don't even have to be hosted on the Chocolatey site. They can just be a pointer. So Chocolatey is basically just kind of a metadata broker for these things. But what the great thing about having Chocolatey available to us now is it gives us that metadata that's important, like, is this thing installed, and is it the latest version, or is it this specific version? So we have a module in Ansible that wraps up Chocolatey, called WinChocolatey. If at all possible, when you're doing app installation maintenance things, use Chocolatey. It's really easy to build your own as well. You can host a Chocolatey server behind your firewall. It's based on NuGet, so I mean, if you're used to the kind of dealing with things in the Windows dev world, NuGet is something that you're probably aware of. It's based on NuGet. You just host a NuGet server behind your firewall. You can post your own private packages to your own server if you don't want to, if you're not using stuff that's in the public one. So we use Chocolatey if at all possible, because that's what gives you the capability to do idempotent package installations on Windows. Now, if for whatever reason Chocolatey is not an option for you, but you've got exes and MSIs hanging out on file shares and things, we also have the WinPackage module. Now, it tries to be idempotent if you do a little bit of work. So for things that, for MSIs, it just kind of works. Like you can give an MSI and say, like, I want to make sure that this package is installed, and it'll do the right thing. For exes, setup.exe kind of things, it's a little harder. You have to go look up the product code, and so that we can tell if the thing is installed or not. You actually have to specify the product code because there's no standard way of doing that in the exe. So again, if you look in the module instructions, it'll tell you kind of where to look for that stuff and how to figure it out. But we also ship, there's one in the box called WinMSI that's been in there since Ansible 1.7, was one of the very first Windows modules. Don't use that. It's been deprecated. WinPackage has superseded it in every way. So use WinPackage if you can't use WinChocolatey. So I'm just going to give you a real quick demo of the WinChocolatey module. And this is the one part of my demo that does require the internet. So hopefully nobody is streaming cat videos or anything right now on the conference Wi-Fi. So let's take a look at this. So this is a really simple playbook that just drives the WinChocolatey module. Again, you're seeing the standard Ansible playbook syntax here, right? I mean, the module name is different, but everything else, this is all normal Ansible stuff. There's no Windows in your Ansible here. It's all just Ansible. So all we're doing is we're just executing the WinChocolatey module, and we're saying we want to see the procx package, and its state should be present. So that's a really simple thing. So if I just do Ansible playbook, use my host file that we created earlier, and then run choco.yml. Now the very first thing this is going to do, this is a brand new machine. I've never installed Chocolatey on it. The module knows that. It's going to go out and say, oh, Chocolatey's not here, or it's not up to date. Let's go ahead and install Chocolatey first. So the module right now is downloading and installing Chocolatey on that target. And so it'll take a little longer the first time because there's a bunch of extra stuff that's going on. It's quite a bit faster once Chocolatey's been installed. And so we'll see how slow the conference Wi-Fi is today. Oh, that's not bad. Okay. So it comes back. There's a warning that says we had to do a Chocolatey upgrade because it wasn't there before. And then we see that it's changed. So if I run this again, it should come back very quickly because Chocolatey's already installed and the package that we asked for is already there. So again, idempotent operation, just like you would expect from Ansible, and everything's there. So just to show you there's nothing up my sleeve here, we'll go back to our Windows machine here. And if I go procexp, we should see Process Explorer come up. Yay, okay, it works. Okay. So the next thing everybody loves to hate about Windows, you can't do anything on Windows without rebooting it. Am I right? So the rebooting things when you're doing configuration management is kind of painful, especially push mode configuration management, right? Where I'm reaching out to a thing and somewhere in the management of this thing, the machine disappears on me because it got rebooted. So this is a hard problem to solve. I've had this discussion with a couple of people here that were kind of begging for a Linux version of a reboot module. So we ship a thing in Ansible called WinReboot that takes care of all of that stuff for you. It takes care of the nastiness of did this machine go down and did the reboot succeed? Do I actually have rights to reboot it? It takes care of all of that nastiness in a single task. So you just say WinReboot, and your playbook basically will pause until the machine is responding again to management requests on whatever your protocol happens to be, whether it's WinRM, SSH, whatever. It makes that trivial to do. So when you're doing some kind of a complex orchestration, if you're doing software updates, if you're doing NIC updates, if you're doing things that need to reboot the machine, it's okay. We can deal with it. And there was a community guy that actually pulled out about half the code out of the back end of the WinReboot module and made his own thing called wait for connection. So any of you that have seen that action before, it's basically the second half of the reboot. It's poke at this thing until it answers on the management protocol on the management protocol and is properly available for management. So this is a nice thing if you're doing things with clouds. If you're standing up something in the cloud and you want to kind of bang on it until it's ready, wait for connection is a great way to do that. And that one, wait for connection, is agnostic. It will work on Linux machines, Windows, anything. The next one everybody loves to hate, and actually we'll also see a demo of the reboot stuff later. But the next thing everybody loves to hate about Windows, of course, is Windows Update. So I don't know about you, but when I owned a bunch of Windows machines and we had to do things within a maintenance window, it was always kind of a nightmare. We'd use SCCM, we'd use some other, the third-party products to try and do patch management, but hardly any of them do anything kind of synchronously. It's all like I've got an agent running over there, and like maybe you can poke the agent and it'll do some stuff, but as much automation as we tried to throw at this thing, there were always cases where we'd end up logging into the machine and like clicking the Windows Update button and just waiting for it to run. I mean, I'm sure people here have had the same experience. Windows Update, the WinUpdates module that we ship in Ansible is like basic synchronous updates. It's again kind of like the WinReboot. There's a bunch of complexity under the covers there around download stuff, apply things. If the machine needs to reboot, it will go ahead and reboot it. If you need to do 3 or 4 cycles of that, it's fine. It's all completely hidden from you. So all you have to do is say, WinUpdates, give it a category, tell it what you want, and it'll use whatever your configured update source is. So, an out-of-the-box Windows machine is going to use like the public Windows Update server, but if you're using WSUS in your org or using some other software update source, whatever the configured source is on the machine, that's what WinUpdates is going to use. Now, the other nice thing that's really new in Ansible 2.5, so it used to be one of the things, remember I said there's things that you can't do in WinRM? One of the things, so amazingly, one of the things you can't do in WinRM is use Windows Updates. You can't apply Windows Updates, you can't apply hotfixes. So there's some really weird little tricks that we had to do to make that work. So before 2.5, it was like run those things in a scheduled task. So it's like start a scheduled task that does all these things and then kind of report back. And the scheduled task thing was kind of janky sometimes, and like if you ran it as 2 different users, it would get upset, and there were just some weird cases in there. So in 2.5, that stuff is gone. It will actually transparently run the stuff under an interactive session as system, and then we also added, as I mentioned, the auto reboot capability. So this is what a WinUpdates task looks like. This one task will update a machine with everything that's sitting out there for critical updates. It will reboot it as many times as it needs to, and then you can also do things like blacklist KBs. So if there's a brand new KB or there's one that's problematic, you can give it a blacklist to say like, don't install this. You can also go the other way with it. There's also a whitelist that was added in 2.5, so you can say only, there are these 3 really critical things that we need. Only install those. Don't worry about any of the others right now. So blacklist, whitelist, lots more flexibility there that was added in 2.5. Very nice stuff. Everybody hates IIS, right? It's to be fair, IIS has gotten a whole lot better. I mean, I was doing things back in like IIS 2, IIS 3 time, and like IIS 6, 7, 8, like it's gotten a whole lot better. It's a lot more Apache-like, but still, IIS can be a pain to deal with sometimes. Ansible gives you some very basic modules for dealing with the things that you need to do to deploy stuff into IIS. So you can create websites, you can configure listeners, you can do basic web app stuff, creating an app pool, managing app pool identities, like setting up virtual directories, all those kinds of things. Just the basics, but again, there's also a bunch more stuff in DSC if you need to do something that we don't provide. It can make dealing with IIS a lot less painful. You're not dealing with XML. You're not dealing with metabases. You're not doing all the things that make people lose hair dealing with IIS. So just a couple of samples here again. So this creates the web. This is basically like ensures that the website that ships with IIS, as soon as you install IIS, it's going to create a site called default website that sits at c inet pub //. root. So this just says make sure that's there. And then the next task here, we're just creating a web app called Orchard CMS, and we're putting it underneath inet pub // root orchard. And it'll go and make sure that that's all there and then configured properly for the users that need to access it. The registry. So this is one of the very common Windows problems that people. The registry seems to be really scary to people who don't know what it is, but it is the Windows configuration store. Pretty much anything that needs to store settings, the registry is where it lives on Windows, unless it's a cross-platform thing, and then maybe it'd have a config file. But pretty much anything that's Windows native, it's going to live in the registry. So Ansible provides you the basic tools that you need to manage individual key values in an idempotent fashion, and that's the WinRegEdit module. And there's also a bulk import that can do idempotent bulk import setup, and that's with WinRegMerge. So if you've exported a set of crypto settings or some other thing like that, or you're templating a whole bunch of, you've got a whole bunch of files and you don't, or a whole bunch of reg keys that you need to manage and you don't want to do it in a loop, you can either template the thing out into a registry file and use WinReg merge, or you can export it from kind of a golden master machine or whatever you need to do. So just a couple of samples what that looks like. Again, just WinReg edit, we're going to give it a path to a key, and we're going to give it the name and the name of the value, and then the actual value we're going to stick in there. And then WinReg merge, obviously, very simple. You just give it a path to a file and say, like, make sure this stuff is in the registry. And it's, again, idempotent, just like normal. If there's nothing to do, it'll come back and say, I didn't do anything. So services is another kind of unique Windows thing, although it feels like systemd kind of borrowed a lot of ideas from the Windows Service Control Manager. But you'll notice that when you're dealing with this in Ansible, we make this look very much like the service module that kind of abstracts. It tries to abstract at least the basics of the various init systems. The WinService module looks very similar to those, and I'll show you that example in a second. But it does the things that you need to do, though. It gives you access. It gives you really fine control over all of the service behaviors that you can do in Windows. So the kind of who, what, when, how, like when should this service start, like who's the service, what's the service identity, is the service enabled or not, like does it have a delayed start, what do I do when the service dies, those kinds of things. WinService module gives you control over all that. So a couple examples of this one. So the first one is just make sure the IIS service is running. We just give it the service name and state running. Doesn't get much simpler than that. And then the second one's a little more complex. So we're saying make sure that the firewall service is not running, and then we set the start mode on it to disabled. So we could have done, this is another one of those places where we diverged a little bit from the Linux service module UI, because the Linux service module says instead of start mode, it has enabled. So you can say enabled, yes, no. But Windows is a little more complex than that, right? Because you have manual start, auto start, disabled, delayed start, and I think there's even one new one now in one of the newer versions. So there's a lot more options that you have to deal with. So this is a choice where we made the choice to actually diverge the UI a little bit from the service module to make sure that we could support those extra things instead of just a Boolean enabled or not. Domains. So domains can be kind of the bane of people's existence. I know back when I was doing things, we needed to do software testing, where we actually had software that ran under a domain environment. And it was a real pain because standing up a domain in a test environment, like a throwaway domain, is kind of a hard thing. So we'd end up having this domain controller that would get slower and slower and slower the more tests we ran against it. And so we'd have to go every few months, blow the thing away, and start it over. So Ansible makes this a non-issue. In Ansible, you can stand up a domain, you can stand up an entire new domain and domain controller in a new forest with a single task. So I'll show you that in a second. Domains make auth kind of complicated. On the Ansible side, we support all of the options that WinRM makes available. So you can auth with NTLM, you can auth with Kerberos, you can do CredSSP, you can do, and then for non-domain stuff, you can do basic auth and certificate auth. So all of those options are available to you if you have a domain environment. And as I said, Ansible makes throwaway domains really easy. I've got a task that will show that in a second. It's easy also to promote and depromote domain controllers, and then it also makes leaving and joining a domain very easy for domain member servers and for workstations. And then we also are starting to bring in some modules for doing basic domain object management, so things like users and OUs and machine accounts and things like that. So those things are just starting to filter in. Expect more of those in the next couple of releases. So creating a brand new domain from scratch, one task. So we give it the domain name, the DNS domain name, and it goes out and talks to the target machine and says, hey, target machine, do you see a domain here? And if it doesn't, it's like, okay, I'm going to make you a domain controller then. And then the only thing we need to know, the minimum thing we need to know to create a new domain in New Forest is just what's the safe mode password going to be. That's it. So that thing that thing takes care of it. And then the next one is just to create a domain user. We're creating somebody. We're giving him we're giving the user principal name in that user at domain format, and then we're telling it what groups the guy should be in. Pretty easy. So I'm going to show you, I'm actually going to do a domain join demo here real quick. So I have a playbook here called join domain. So the very first thing we have to do, again, this is using my machine that I just stood up here. And so if you've got DHCP and everything's working, then you don't need this part of it. If the machine already comes up and is using the domain controller, or the thing to be the domain controller as its DNS server, you don't have to do this part. But since these are just a couple of vagrant boxes, I need to tell it like, hey, use the domain controller as your DNS server so that you can find all the, that you can locate the domain controller basically when I ask you for it. So the real meat of it, though, is this middle task, the win domain membership task. So again, we tell it what's the DNS domain name we want to join, ansible.vagrant. We give it we can optionally change the host name if we want. I'm going to just make it new host 3. And then we put the domain admin user and password in plain text. Don't do it this way, please. This is for demo purposes only. If you were doing this for real, you would use like Ansible Vault, or you would look it up out of a password, password vault, something like that. So you would have that be a variable that is sourced from something but not sitting in plain text. But this is a demo, and like I'm not worried about you guys breaking into my machine with my super secure password there. So. And then the last thing we do is we say we want the thing to be in the domain state. So the other option there is workgroup. So if we switch that to workgroup, then it would put us in a workgroup named whatever. We have to specify a workgroup name that we want it to be. Now the last thing we do here is we register the output from the win domain membership. And the reason we do that is because what do you have to do right after you join a domain? Got to reboot, right? So we only do that when we need to, though, right? So we want this to be idempotent. We want to be able to rerun this over and over again. I don't want to have to reboot the dumb machine every time I run the playbook. Like, I don't need to do that. That's not necessary. So the win domain membership module will tell us if we need to reboot or not. So we just check that. We do a conditional win reboot, and we only do it when reboot required is true. So we're going to run that join domain playbook. This one actually, like, I've had it crap out on me a couple times because the domain controller VM kind of goes to sleep on me, but usually it works pretty well. So we noticed that our WinDNS client reported a change because we were using whatever the conference Wi-Fi DNS was before. So we've switched it now to a static DNS entry that says, hey, talk to the domain controller. Domain membership module came back and reported a change because we had to join the domain. And now we can see that the win reboot task is running. So notice that my remote desktop window went away there. So as soon as this comes back, OK, it's finished. So my win reboot reported a change because it rebooted, and the playbook's done. So if I come and connect back to my Windows machine now, we can see that it has joined the domain. So by looking at this, we can see that we are now a member of the ansible.vagrant domain, just as we asked it to be, and the machine came back. Now, the cool thing about this, again, because this is idempotent, right? So I should be able to run this again and have it report no changes because it's already in the right state. So the DNS server's already pointed the right place. We're already a member of the domain. So, and since the win reboot task was conditional on the output of that module telling us we needed to reboot, which we don't, it was skipped. So completely idempotent, very nice and easy ways to deal with getting machines on and off a domain. ACLs. So Windows ACLs are kind of the stuff of nightmares, although SE Linux is right behind it. So it's they're a little more granular in general than Linux permissions. Like everything in Windows is secured by an ACL. Whether you knew it or not, like it's not just the file system. Like services, system objects, like all these things have ACLs on them, and usually they're just kind of set for the administrator group. But you can do whatever you want with them. Show of hands in the room, who has written SDDL? Masochists. Masochists, I tell you. Okay, so this is SDDL. This is not a human readable format. Don't do this. Like this is serialization of a binary format that you don't have to care about. This is much nicer. So these are a couple of the Ansible modules that can manage ACLs. So WinOwner, very simple. We're just saying, like, you know, I've got this directory called some app under program files. I want the administrator to be the owner, and I want you to recurse through the entire structure and make administrator the owner of everything underneath it. Nice and simple. You know, you could do the same thing with cackles or whatever, but it wouldn't be idempotent. It's going to run through and do that whole thing every time. This is a little snappier once it's already in the right state. Now, same thing WinACL. We're saying, okay, on ctemp, I want to add these I'm going to add the read, execute, write, and delete rights for the users group, and I want those to be inherited by both the containers and the individual things down underneath there. This is a whole lot simpler than that, in my mind. It's a whole lot more readable, and it really follows the Ansible philosophy of human readable playbooks, right? Like, that's pretty self-explanatory. You can see what's going on, and you know, anybody can look at that and see what's happening. And that's really the goal there. Whether it's Linux, whether it's a network device, whether it's Windows, anything, that underlying philosophy of like human readable, I think we've achieved it here. So I promised you guys a poem. So let's, I'll give you my version of Kat's poem to Patrick about how she feels. And this is, you know, how you might feel about Windows after learning to use Ansible with it. I hate that you're not SSH and the shell that you call power. I hate the way you install your apps. Windows Update makes me glower. I hate the way you must reboot and your web server IIS. I hate your complex registry. It always is a mess. I hate your janky services and your stupid domain auth. And managing your ACLs is sure to leave me wroth. I hate that you're not Linux, that I have to learn you at all, but with Ansible on my tool belt, I don't hate you. Not even close, not even a little bit, not even at all.